Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today for the ISIS seminar titled Subalternising Geopolitics, Small States in South Asia. To speak on this topic today, we are delighted to have with us Professor Natasha Gall, Director of the Center for the Study of Democracy and Professor of Politics, International Relations and Critical Interdisciplinary Studies at the University of Westminster in London, UK. The session today will be chaired by Dr. Amit Ranjan, Research Fellow at this institute. Our event today will also be live streamed on the ISIS Facebook page. And with that, I now invite Dr. Ranjan to start the session.
Thanks, Saab. Thank you, Professor. Before can speak, I would like to make a very brief comments on this small state is. A state may be small because of its demographic, territorial size, and economic and military capability. But it can be more important than many other countries of the world because of time and location. In the last few years, due to escalation of tensions between USA and China and rise of political heat between India and China, has further increased the significance of many small states from South Asia, such as Nepal, Maldives, and Bhutan. Among the three, Bhutan is the only country where Beijing does not have its physical and diplomatic presence. Though the two countries share long borders and are engaged in talks over their territorial matters, causing concerns to New Delhi. With this brief comments, like Professor, you to make your presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ranjan, and also to Saad, who introduced me. It's a pleasure to be here and to to be speaking with all of you. So, Dr. Ranjan, I got in touch with Dr. Ranjan some time ago, and one of the things that I mentioned is that I would like to make links and find things that we have in common. So please don't think of today as just me speaking to you and telling you about certain things, although it will be partly that as well, but as as an invitation to fellow academics at any career stage to reach out if there are any points of common interest, because I'm really keen to build all sorts of collaborative linkages with scholars who have certain research interests in common. So and I'm easy to find online, but also after the talk, if you want, I'm happy to kind of share a business card and communicate further. So that's one preface remark. The other is that I wasn't aware that this was going to be live streamed, but also hello to virtual audiences for now or in the future. But yeah, would be lovely to get a copy of that. And if anyone takes pictures, please send them to Dr. Ranjan so that he can send them to me so that I'd be happy to share. Okay, now I'm rather old style here, so I will actually not have any PowerPoint or anything, but just some thoughts. And I want to really before that, I want to ask you, is there anyone here who is a priori interested in small states, has worked on small states, just so that kind of helps me? No? Okay, one person. Okay, all right. Well, you're all in a small state, obviously, I'm not going to be talking about Singapore because my focus is South Asia. But I think what I want to do today is to talk to you about the particular ways in which we understand geopolitics. And I guess at the broadest, my argument is about how we need to really liberate geopolitics from neo-realist constraints, not simply because it is sort of like a normative or ethical imperative, but also because it makes sense. And in fact, it is the rational thing to do, I would argue. So, and also the personal trajectory in reaching this argument that I'm going to make today involves not just me, but in a broader sense, a lot of scholars who, well, maybe not a lot, but certainly, innovations within international relations and scholars who increasingly want to understand the variations of geopolitical conduct across different kinds of states, and people who specifically work on small states. So there's a body of work, and I'm also happy to share references with you later, should you wish to engage in this conversation further. So that's kind of one thing. The other thing is that over the years, my interest in small states began from my work on Bhutan, which you have already just referred to. And as somebody who first went to Bhutan in 2006 and followed quite closely the transition to democracy there, and then subsequently, especially the first and the third elections, and actually the fourth as well. So it's been a long-standing association with a small state, and the coming into being of certain kinds of perspectives that I arrived both through a mix of thinking but also experience and interactions of why we needed to put different ideas on the table. So that's one motivation. The other has been my students. So over the years, I have either supervised or I'm in the process of supervising PhDs, that are being written by students who are from Bhutan, from Nepal, from Maldives. And the concerns that these students have, the ways in which when they enter into the field of politics and international relations, their questions are very different from the sorts of questions that you would expect the mainstream IR to be thinking about. Maldivian students who want to understand why their country's foreign policy has been so kind of varied and made such dramatic changes over time. Likewise, PhD students from Nepal or who work on Nepal, thinking about how does great power politics and the region of rivalry in South Asia affects them. Similarly, in Bhutan, how we think about spheres of influence and naturalize a certain kind of vocabulary, how it affects them. So the questions that are posed by scholars from those small states are I think, an invitation for all of us to think more seriously about the particularities presented by small states. So, okay. I'm going to come to talk about specific and Dr. Ranjan said I could speak for about half an hour. So if I begin sort of about now, and then I speak for half an hour, and then please ask me questions, because I think that'll be the more interesting part of our discussion. So small states, as you already mentioned, there's no universally agreed idea of what smallness is. Small can mean very different things. There are, however, there is some consensus that smallness usually translates into either small size territorially or small population size. Sometimes you could, scholars stretch that to talk about small economies or even small relative to, so, asymmetric kind of size. So not small per se. However, in the case of the South Asian countries that we just mentioned, they often fit all of those criteria. So the definitional disagreements don't really apply, because they're often like small on all of these parameters. Now, so small states are small in, I'm going to kind of just stick to the script here. So the Himalayan small states, that was my starting point, led me to think more broadly about the ways in which small states present a complexity, and that why we need to subalternize geopolitics. And subaltern, I'm using the word subaltern, and I think I first used it in 2010 at an IDSA talk. This is a long time ago, and I was making this argument that if we're understanding geopolitics from the perspective of great powers downwards, as it were, then we get one particular understanding of what's going on. Whereas if we reverse that and looked at things from the point of view of the small state upwards, our understanding and the questions that we think that are worth attending to would be different. The reason to subalternize geopolitics, I think, is because it helps move us beyond the traditional rivalrous tropes of, in this case, of course, India and China. I've also worked on, on what I've called asymmetrical in-betweenness, that small states tend to be seen as sort of arenas for the playing out of a rivalry between different powers, and that it is quite important to highlight the endogenous drivers of the agency of small states, which means paying close attention to the role of elites and to the domestic politics within those small states, and arriving at the same questions that we might be looking at from the perspective of, say, Delhi or Beijing, but looking at those questions from the perspective of the small states outwards and upwards. The reason why this is important is because I think conventional history and strategy is overlaid by a sort of an almost imperial understanding, not necessarily always one kind of imperial, but an imperial understanding, which is often orientalist, often stereotypical. It's selective. It is selective, and it normalizes certain understandings of what security means without enabling us to ask the questions of what it means for whom. So the agency, the existence, and the strategic priorities of small states need to be, I would argue theoretically, that these need to be acknowledged and taken seriously within within how we understand the international system. And moreover, that to understand the workings of great power, we actually need to disaggregate and pay attention to the sub-regional shifts, and these could include material flows, public discourses, human movements. Just to pluck an example out of the air, for example, that what Maldives wants from Bangladesh may be very different to what Bhutan wants from Bangladesh in terms of either labor or capital. So I think subalternizing geopolitics, I want to make the argument that subalternizing geopolitics is a theoretical position that advocates critically examining major power narratives for their historical blind spots, ingrained paternalist tropes, and reflexive insecurities. And why we need this is to better assess and mitigate the complex political impacts of various transborder challenges, which include not only territorial conflicts and border disputes, although of course include that as well, but increasingly they're intertwining with public discourses, human movement, economic and climate vulnerabilities, in the sense that all of these challenges require us to look at the specificities. Small states are not just, as a scholar has said, small states are not just large states writ small. They're not just exceptional, they're not just exotic. They present a certain, they present to us a certain, a canvas for understanding the workings of politics in a different way. And I argue that that's important. Environment, I've come back to this a couple of times, but environmental policies, I think, are a good way in which we can see the norm entrepreneurship of small states, being actors in the international system that, that don't have the conventional fallback of military or economic power. These states are keen to champion norms, and in a world where greater multilateralism and more friendly relations between countries are what we would desire for, I guess, for planetary security, actually looking at the globe right now, it makes sense to not just treat these actors as peripheral in the way in which we are used to, but to take these actors as as entities that might allow us to think of and index what we mean by power and what we mean by security differently. One example of this is if we think about climate change mitigation. Smaller states, especially smaller democratic or democratizing states, do quite well. I think in general, one could make the argument, and not too long ago, somebody was mentioning that, there's a long history to this argument, including going back to Rousseau, that the smaller the unit, the better the policy, that the smaller the scale in which you have to function, the more sense it makes. So it's partly that, it's partly things like environment, where I think that this actually has a lot of purchase. But I would even add that there is a normative, aspect to this argument, which is about denaturalizing certain geopolitical constructs and not taking them as given. So, for example, what does it mean in international relations scholarship? And one of my PhD students is working on it. What does it mean in international relations scholarship when the idea of something like spheres of influence is taken as a given and as granted, and is just seen as something that is very natural, right? Where do we get that from? What is the imperial kind of history of that concept, or indeed of that metaphor and that vocabulary? So I think that while we cannot, I'm not naive, I think, to the extent to think that we could kind of completely undo this vocabulary that we have grown so used to and kind of found our that is so central to the discipline. But it is, I think, possible to attach certain kinds of questions and values, including negative values, to the use of vocabularies that naturalize these kinds of behaviors and including like speech acts. So spheres of influence, I would, just the other day, somebody was talking about it in the news. I'm too jet lagged to remember exactly when, but exactly in what context. But the ubiquity of the vocabulary of spheres of influence, for example, bears some thinking about, and how that structures perception. The thing with geopolitics that hasn't happened enough, but which has happened in a lot of disciplines to a lot of concepts, is that the constructed nature of it is often not paid attention to. The idea is that we somehow arrive at a certain understanding of what the situation is, what the power play is, what security means in that situation, whose interests are we attending to, as if it was existing fully formed. Whereas I think a constructivist perspective, even the standard constructivist perspective, would tell us that these are things that are constructed in the moment in which they are presented as being existing out there, already fully formed. So we are in fact constructing these things in that moment. And so you can think of it, I said at the beginning that, in my conversations with various colleagues, there are various ways I keep coming up with framing this. And I said to you at the start, about liberating geopolitics from neorealism, but it's also, another way of looking at it is that this is about unsexing geopolitics, the idea of what power is, and what does it, and what counts as humiliation in a certain context. These terms, including smallness, is entirely bound up with certain understandings, so that what states choose to be are not offended by being called small states. Why do small states pursue certain kinds of alliances more than others, and why do we have such paucity of literature on relations that small states have with each other, as opposed to the focus that there is often on the relations of small states with their bigger neighbors or with bigger powers? So these are not sort of abstract questions. I think that they create the very frames within which we understand a certain region. And so yeah, and given that we are increasingly, I think, globally concerned more with, I'm going to use the term, but of course we are welcome to discuss this further, rules-based order, because I know anytime anybody uses that term, there's like, rules-based order, really? So, but for the moment, I'll just kind of use this term under erasure, that to the extent that we are concerned about a rules-based order, I think it does mean that we have to think about more seriously attending to, in scholarship and in terms of the scholarship frames, the ways in which the kinds of international actors that have greater investments in rules-based order, because they are not served as well by, just the use of brute force, as it were. So I think there, again, there's an argument for why small states are important. I think this is an interesting innovation in international relations in the last decades, and we've come a long way from the initial skepticism in the 60s and 70s, where people did understand that the Lilliputians could get, the bigger entities to fight their wars for them. But at the same time, now I think there's a growing realization of why per se we need to pay closer attention to small states. I think specifically in the context of disputes, long-standing entrenched territorial disputes, such as the disputes around borders, I think paying attention to questions and framings from the perspectives of small states help us to diversify understandings of what we mean by irrational, infeasible, or undesirable when it comes to certain kinds of resolutions of conflicts, because it makes it imperative for us to ask irrational for whom, undesirable for whom, and infeasible for whom. This is the sort of question that I think critical scholars, especially feminists and others, have argued for a long time, that when we are posing these constructs, we should also always attach these to specific kinds of actors and ask for whom. So I think this is also about that. And it is a kind of speaking from the margin, asking us to rethink the agenda of international relations if we talk about mainstreaming small states. But I think there is an ancestry of this paradigm that forces us to think not just the rational or supposedly rational, but also the relational basis for understanding state action and interaction. Small states do not seek expansion often, recognizing agency of small states, And the need for security from the perspective of small states, I think, is important. I think a possible international relations agenda, if we took the initiatives of small states seriously, would be very different on climate and environment. I think it would also be, the example, for instance, of the treaty on the what's the full form of TPNW, Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Various such initiatives that globally have been brought into being by the efforts of small states, I think is important. So instead of looking at small as abject or small as weak or small as unimportant, I want to make a fairly strong case that thinking about a sort of a region or an order that isn't based on the standard imperially inherited ways of thinking about power as the organizing principle makes sense. Now, I could, the other thing is, I could also, I would say that when we look at these small states, they are generally effective, results-oriented, multilateral diplomacy, and I think diplomacy is something that, including in these, maybe you'll ask me questions, and that's when we get to the specific cases of these countries, which have certainly, if we look at Bhutan, I mean, I think that diplomacy argument stands. The focused goals and better coordination, I already mentioned rules-based global order, act as norm entrepreneurs. And I think that I want to stop here and give detailed answers to your questions, because I want to know what. Yeah, I think I want to get into the empirical detail when you ask me questions. But that's the proposal or the thesis that I put to you, is that we should take small states more seriously, that it makes ethical, epistemological sense to do so, that it helps us arrive at better scholarly understandings of what we are about. But also, I would argue that it strategically makes sense for states big and small to look at things in this way, rather than condemn us to a perpetual situation of rivalry, polarization, and suboptimal outcomes.
Yeah, thank you, Professor, for your insightful talk on small states. I hope it will attract many questions. So the floor is open. Please introduce yourself and before asking questions.
Or comments or remarks. Yeah, please.
My name is Jain. Okay. I'm a senior research fellow visiting here for 2 months. You mentioned about small states take better decisions. If I take the example of the Maldives, the current president decided to kind of switch the country's relationship from India to China. So what gives these leaders in a small states agency to make such big decisions? That's my question.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Could you repeat that last line? What gives?
Them agency.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the first line, can I respond to this or should we? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think I don't think I'm going to say that small states take better decisions, because we inhabit the world in the frame, and the frames that structure it. My argument is that small states can take better decisions, and those decisions would be beneficial for everyone were we to take the concerns and priorities of small states more seriously. So let's drill down to your specific example of Maldives. Now, and again, I will acknowledge that this is what I say to you is, of course, what I think, but it's also based on the work of scholars that I work with, who are doing amazing, interesting work. So in the context of Maldives, the fact that this particular small state has been caught at the center of this rivalry, the India-China rivalry, since it democratized, is an interesting question for us to look at how that, whose interests does that serve and how does that play out? Because if you look at it from 2008 onwards, there have been these rapid shifts in the foreign policy depending on which government comes to power. So in a sense, the domestic politics of a small state is completely sort of, buffeted depending on who is in power, and often quite radically so. Now, you might say that that's not, why should Delhi or Beijing be concerned about that? Well, one, because I think in the in the long run you can get more done by goodwill than you can by coercion. I think so. That's like one argument, which is a self-interest argument. Secondly, I think it serves no one to have these rapid changes happen when there are sunk cost investments. So if we think about something like GMR, we think about the helicopter story and many other cases. What these kinds of cases reveal to us is that because there is no stability and because there is this rapid switching from one side to the other, which is the result of a certain kind of construction, which is about looking at the interests of Delhi and Beijing rather than Malay. So that feeds into this instability. It does not generate any certainty, including for Delhi and Beijing, and also oftentimes it's materially it imposes material costs, because you have investments, you plan on the basis of that, you think that's where you'll be in 5 years time, but in 5 years time instead you're stuck in diplomatic wrangles, you're stuck with having to take cases to various kinds of arbitration and courts. One or the other entity is losing money. It doesn't help plan for the 5 or 10 years ahead. It doesn't give a good signal. That is not, it is the way in which things work, and one could just say, well, that's too bad, you were born small and therefore deal with it. But on the other hand, we could also think about, could we create schemas in our scholarship that help us address these relations in better and less rivalrous terms, which doesn't mean that Delhi doesn't care about Delhi or Beijing shouldn't care about Delhi, but it should also mean that Mali should not only be about these rapid fluctuating shifts between, kind of in very rivalrous possessive terms, between Delhi and Beijing. Because that is, I would argue that that's the kind of the result in practice that we get from this, is that you just kind of rent friends for 5 years and then something happens and everything changes again. So it's not, I'm not saying that we abandon interests that any state, in fact, if I were addressing a room of, say, scholars who are interested in, not IR scholars, I think the question they would be putting to me is, why are you still keeping the state at the center of your analysis if you want to be critical? And I've often been asked that question too by an entirely different community of scholars. And I think that my position is actually midway. So I'm not saying that let's just move away from thinking about the state. I think the state is here. The state is going to remain relevant, whatever state it is that we're talking about. So I'm not talking about sub-state level things. I'm just talking about how we think about the relations between states in a way that we can ask questions from the point of view of small states outwards. Because the default way of approaching this is what Delhi wants, and not at all about how can this be about something that Malay does better. So that's, I guess that would be my answer to this. Okay, thank you. Oh, also, and when it comes to diplomacy, I think it's interesting that that there is a lot more learning, reflexiveness and reflexivity, and also a certain kind of, I think, niceness when it comes to small state behaviors, which means that they will not dig their heels in and say, well, you're either a friend or an enemy. You could say that, well, that's because they can't afford to, perhaps, but states also do choose very clear alliances and just do that thing. But I think a lot of small states genuinely don't want to be caught in this either or situation, where and you can see that, including in the Maldives case, that they do want to preserve their interests where it suits them, but also they are quite happy not to unnecessarily alienate. Of course, one can't speak for every person in every government at every time, but broadly speaking, if you follow the diplomatic statements quite closely, you would see that there's a sense of reflexivity, including in the recent statements by Maldives.
Look at the small states,
Yes.
especially if you look at Maldives, power elites are more divided in issue of foreign policy or any other decision-making process than the bigger states. So they don't there's nothing called institutionalized decision-making process. or it's more divided?
Yes, I don't think, I think I agree. And I think that, the idea of looking out from the center of a bigger power is that they're either with us or they're against us. And to study I don't want to get into huge detail because I could just go on talking about it, that the political parties in say any country A, small country A, that this party is in our favor and this party is not in our favor. Well, actually, I think, and I'm not the only one, but if you closely spend time and study the detailed domestic politics of any small state, more often than not, you would find that there is the de facto level is actually not that the parties genuinely do not care for their own interest and actually want to align with either, but that's a kind of externally, imposed polarization, and often is not actually, in practice, it's not the most relevant cleavage when it comes to those parties, because at a certain level, fundamentally, the parties very often will be concerned about their own state welfare. So I think that there's also that, that sense that you were saying, that there's a sense in which small state domestic politics is seen by the external bigger powers, and there's a sense in which that isn't really the whole story. And I think that's also something I want to throw into the mix. Yeah. Sorry, someone was speaking here, and I'm very sorry I had an afterthought.
Hi, my name is Manish Maheshwari. For the last 28 years, I have been a banker by day. And ever since the internet arrived in 1999 in Delhi, I've been a historian, at least an amateur historian by night. So that's what brings me here. I think if you look at what is now called South Asia, at one time was called India, and then the Indian subcontinent. When the British left, there were 562 different Riyasat, kingdom, whatever you call them, plus British India. Barely half a dozen of them were large enough to survive as independent sovereign states of any capability at all. And the largest of them by land area collapsed within a week when Pakistan sent what they call Kabylis, but were actually plainclothes men mixed with the general riffraff of society. Imagine we go back and the British didn't give them a choice to either join this or that dominion and just said, well, you're free to do what you want. And then you have this plethora of 562 states and your theory of subalternizing geopolitics. The only way they could survive is if the larger powers around them, whether it was Pakistan or Nizam's domain or whoever, exercised self-restraint and didn't go in. And then game theory comes in. If I don't grab this state, the other guy will, so why don't I grab him first? And then this goes back to not 1947, this goes back to caveman days. I like your tiger skin, I'll just snatch it from you. I like your cave, I'll take your cave. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that power grabs of the most naked kind are so intrinsic to the human mind. We can wrap them up in all kinds of niceties on the diplomatic front. But not every country produces a prime minister who refuses a UN Security Council permanent seat and then crows about it as an achievement when he actually scored a huge self-goal. Where will you find these idealistic men or women running these large countries who will say, I am going to exercise self-restraint, not go in to, say, Ukraine, even though the West is about to grab Ukraine? I'm just wondering about the idealistic world and the realistic world.
Okay, so thank you. That's actually like that's a lot of things to respond. So what I will do is that I will respond to what you've said in terms of a few bullet points, right? They may not exactly correlate in the same order, but firstly, I think that you're right in pointing out that the small size of a feudal farm or an authoritarian, kind of kingdom of the absolutist kind ruled by a despot doesn't obviously offer a very good example of smallness. And luckily, that's not the argument I'm making. So I am referring to small states in terms of, remember when I said it at the start, small democratizing or democratic states. So I am referring to small states that are non-absolutist, not despotic small states. I think often one has to, I mean, I guess it makes sense to externalize that, but my prime concern is with democracies, is with when I'm thinking about small states. And I do personally, I would argue that I place a value on democracy as a form of government that is higher and more positive as opposed to other kinds of governments, simply because I think that there shouldn't be a trade-off between economic and political welfare, economic welfare and political rights. That you might get, a higher standard of living, but I think that it isn't a Western ploy to say that people should have other rights, because I would argue that there's a contrapuntal reading of history that's available to us that tells us that in every society at every time there have been people who have striven for greater rights, who have actually wanted more rights, or who have wanted to challenge injustices. So it isn't a global north, global south, or west, non-west thing when it comes to rights. In fact, I've made that argument in print, that this is something that is a global inheritance. That in fact, when we look at for people who say human rights are human rights talk is a Western ploy, my response to that is, so you're saying that the entire anti-colonial struggle that was carried out in large parts of Asia and Africa was somehow not about human rights? I mean, we can study one as history and the other as politics, but the fact of the matter is that I think that on any latitude and longitude, humans have the capacity to better themselves. And so that's the response. And I don't think it's an idealistic versus realistic thing. In fact, that, I think a lot of the realist, a lot of what the realists present, including in IR as a given, are actually things that wouldn't make sense if we didn't take constructivist narratives into account. So the very fact that a state decides to get, the mother of all bombs or some big whatever, sure, it confers a sense of prestige and power in the normative conventional sense. And the realists would say, well, that's that. But then how does it do so? If you ask that question, then you have to get into the domain of it does so through popular culture projections. It does through speech acts. So including the very obvious things that are supposed to confer power cannot actually do that unless there is a whole storytelling around why that is a marker of power. So actually, I think the realists and constructivists have, one could argue, less of a gap between them. The question about being idealists, I don't think I'm making an entirely normative or an idealist argument, but in any domain, whenever somebody says that, this is an idealist thing, my point is simply that everyone is an idealist. The question is, who are you an idealist for? And, because there's always a circle within which we would want good things. So the question is, can we widen that circle? Can we find overlapping spaces in that circle? So I would reject the equation of idealist as somehow a negative connotation, or even realist as a negative connotation. I think reality is gray and things are gray and in between. So that's about that. So I'm talking about modern post 1945 states in a world in which we've had these waves of democratization, and where when we think about power, we are not paying attention to small states and thinking of what's going on there as peripheral and unimportant. And I'm saying it's strategically useful, but also it's the better thing to do, because it's the better thing to do for security for everyone rather than just the small state. So that's part of it. The last part of what you said, I mean, Ukraine is a whole big story. I wouldn't get into that, but I think it shows us how the naturalization of in-betweenness or rivalry plays out, but in a more practical sense. I mean, when it comes to Ukraine, I think that it has to be understood also within the context of a leader like Putin and a structure that contemporary Russia has, and how that works and what sorts of appeals it works on. Because certainly I remember, like maybe 7, I don't know, a few years back at IR conferences, there's a scholar, Dan Altman, and he was presenting this paper. This is of course before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. He was presenting this paper about, territorial annexations have actually gone down. So it's like this, if you look at the broader sense in the 20th century compared to what was happening before, you actually have a lot less violations of the norm of territorial integrity. So this was what happened in Ukraine, was a whole kind of, a whole different shift in that sense. And And that is, I think, also indicative of the world that we are heading to. And it is a world where these multiplying insecurities are not going to serve anyone well. So I won't go into Ukraine, but I will say that as a former economist and somebody who, who did her PhD in economics and philosophy, and looking at the ways in which the naturalization of terms such as self-interest or economic logic or a certain understanding of rationality have come into being, have very, very complex, interesting, and contested histories. The idea that, this is what it's in human nature. Well, when do we first start using the concept of human nature? Actually, around the same time as people start writing about, writing treatises that have to naturalize and make the capitalist system seem inevitable. So it's not as if capitalism discovered incentives for the first time. It made a certain kind of appeal to incentives as being beyond questioning. So the neoclassical, logic that is rife in the kind of rational actor neoclassical models. This idea that people are selfish, they'll never do anything that's not good for them, and if they do, it must ultimately be helpful to them somehow, is, I think, manifestly challengeable, because no society could be organized in any way to achieve anything were it not for entire realms of care, labor, attention, compassion that we just take for granted. Where the fact that a narrow neoclassical logic has chosen not to recognize the role of care doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. The guy, the actor, and typically the man in these models, and you referred to the caveman. I think there's a certain masculinist history to thinking about interests in that way. But that's not beyond question, and it's certainly, I think, increasingly problematic to argue that the consumers can consume and the producers can produce without there being anyone to take care of people when they fall ill, or just the reproduction of daily life. So a lot of were human beings robots, I think that some kind of that transactional logic would stay, but I don't think we are. I think we're just choosing to not to recognize all of the investments in care, time, effort, attention that human beings make for each other, that cooperation, even when we study evolutionary sociobiology, I mean, the very idea that competition is what creatures do all the time is increasingly contested. I mean, scientists find evidence all the time now of cooperative behaviors in animal societies as well. So there is absolutely nothing kind of natural about any of this. It's a naturalized logic that serves a certain purpose and makes certain kinds of realities unchallengeable. But I don't think that's how it is. Margaret Mead, who was an anthropologist, was once asked why do anthropology? And she said it makes the world, to make the world safer for the study of differences. And she's also the person that, once they had they found a skeleton of somebody and the bone had been healed. And she said, well, that's an example of civilization, because when we care for others, that is an example of civilizations. That is not an idealist argument. And I think that at a very instinctive level, a lot of us will recognize that when we are in need of other people's help. I think that we see that all the time. We're just choosing not to spotlight that in this narrative of what constitutes power, and the idea that all anyone wants is just to go and grab. Yes, well, maybe Putin does, maybe Trump does, but I don't think that's either the norm or that it should be normalized. Sorry, we've kind of veered all over the place, but yeah.
Thank you, Natasha, for that talk. I really enjoyed it.
Sorry, tell me who you are.
I'm Rajni. I'm a researcher at this institute, and I focus mostly on Sri Lankan domestic politics. So I thought it was maybe I would provide a perspective as someone coming from a so-called small state, which is that I would maybe question whether the Sri Lankan state, for example, having a greater voice would exactly subalternize geopolitics. And the reason I would question it is because to a significant degree, our foreign policy does not reflect the interests of a large section of our domestic population. And this is not true of only a small state. If you look at, say, the recent Israel-Palestine conflict, a lot of the domestic demands are not being reflected at the foreign policy. So this is true of major powers, big powers as well. And so that's why I'm kind of interested in questioning whether small states are capable in that sense of adding a strategic voice. And that's, again, I mean, it's a bit of a dilemma, because just to give you an example, so with the Israel-Palestine issue, Sri Lanka has traditionally had a very strong leaning towards Palestine. But in the current context, because of the economic crisis that we are going through, and because the current leadership is more aligned with Western powers, he has taken quite a radical shift on the issue, which includes sending workers to Israel, sending a ship to the Red Sea, and so on. And just trying to grapple with some of that. Another example would be in terms of how a lot of the leadership of these small states negotiate with large international institutions like the IMF. Once again, we see this contradiction between representing the interests of certain financial entities while compromising on the welfare of more vulnerable communities within these countries. And so, yeah, just to close my question, it's how representative is the foreign policy of small states anyway?
So I don't think that one could generalize and say that there is a way in which, like, all small states at all times do foreign policy. However, I think my argument, well, partly there's the idea of what small states are, how small states function in the international arena, and what paying greater attention to the way in which small states function can do for us when we think about multilateralism, when we think about creating consensus on some of the most important issues that we are currently facing globally. When it comes to the not reflecting the interests of domestic constituencies, as you yourself said, that's something that is often the case in all kinds of states. But I think that what makes it harder in the case of a small state is this framework of seeing them simply as kind of arenas for power play, where greater polarization and is often sought to be achieved as a way of kind of shadow boxing. So what makes it harder? Whereas were that not to be the case, I think it would be possible, and we have certain examples of states where we either haven't or still we haven't yet reached the situation where you have the pro-India party or the pro-China party, or the depending on the part of the world, the pro-US, pro-China, whatever. So where that kind of thing has not totally entrenched itself, we actually see the domestic interests better taken into account by the governments. So in other words, what I'm saying is that what we see is actually the consequence of a certain way of thinking about states, where small states are seen as as a given natural sphere or arena where great power politics can and should play out. And I'm saying that thing is problematic, and that were that not to be the case, or were we to ask different sorts of questions of not just what France wants in this country, but what does this country want, what does this African country want, and how should it, how is that better achieved with what kinds of partnerships? So those kinds of questions, they're not changing they're not sort of undoing the realities that we face, but they have the potential to undo those realities if and arrive at better, somewhat better at least scenarios, because they allow us to not see this thing as the default. So the polarization, as I said, where it hasn't happened, governments have been more responsive to citizen demands, and I think that for example, Bhutan and Nepal present a contrast in that sense of this responsiveness, precisely because of the extent of polarization that has happened in one case and not in the other. I guess you could also say that when I said rational and relational, I think that the vocabulary of friendship is used often superficially in in international relations and diplomacy, but I think that there is also a performative element to it when reiterated over long periods of time. There is it kind of entrenches certain kinds of expectations, which is useful for different entities, and perhaps we should use those kinds of relationships as starting points, rather than the rivalrous thing as the given to start out from. So it's more also about, I guess, looking at how can we think about geopolitics differently so that we're just not fixated so much on these schemas, but trying to move away from them. I don't necessarily expect to persuade everyone, so I'm happy also for us to disagree if that is it. But I think that including in the Sri Lankan case, I think in a smaller context, it is easier to be more responsive. What acts as an obstacle to this is often the polarization, this kind of thing that, answering your colleague there, that I was saying that in the case of Maldives. You mentioned, yeah, I've already tried to sidestep Ukraine. I wonder if I should try and do the same with Palestine. It's interesting that nobody thinks of, certain kinds of states as small. So as I said, it's a normative move to talk about what semiotic values can be attached to smallness. So it's not a given, but the fact that that country is both big and small, because India also did the same thing recently, are sending workers to Israel, I think is not necessarily about country size, but may have to do with other expedient, immediate context things that it would probably be hard to get into right now about, whether, we could ask, were it a different government, would they have done the same thing? I think that involves lots of elephants in the room, one of which being the use of violence as resistance, which is, in my view, supremely problematic. And then there's the question of setting of precedents, and how certain kinds of actions make it harder to set precedents. That if you want to, actually, maybe I want to step back from that paragraph and really say something, which is that we should pay greater attention to entrenched conflict and to human suffering of people in conflict, precisely when spectacular acts of violence do not happen. And that means that we should be paying attention to these things, not when there are massacres, not when there are bomb blasts, not when everybody's attention is focused on something, but precisely when that isn't happening, but low-level simmering conflict continues. Because that's when we can really change some part of the chessboard, and we can really change some part of the thinking, and make some moves that will help us get better. Because making those exact same moves in the context of something big and spectacular and violent having happened and having been undertaken by a violent actor risks those precise rational moves being seen as rewards for violent action. And that makes it, I think, difficult for specific, for certain kinds of governments that have the power to actually do something about it. So I think that's all I would say about that. But yeah, Israel-Palestine or Israel, what's going on in Gaza right now is just horrific. And there's, all one can say is that it's like a contest of, it's like competing irrationalities taken to the extreme. It's proxies. It's a lot of, basically, I think I would even say it's a lot of, unwise men making terrible decisions on all sides, and on every side, literally. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Pushpa Sharma. I am also with ISS, and I come from Nepal. Well, I'm not a student of international relations, so my question might be naive. But I was just thinking over, listening to the discussions here. Of course, smallness is relative. Whether you would call Nepal small or not depends on what you're looking at, right? If you look at the population of 30 million, actually it's not very small compared to countries in the world. But if you look at the economy, really it's very small. And looking at where it is placed between China and India, if you look at the map, it's really very small, tiny. But if you compare that with some other countries, it's not too small either. But in terms of the relationship with geopolitics, is it actually the smallness, in whatever terms we think about it, that makes a difference, or is it something else to it? Meaning, like the current context in South Asia, as it is said that, say, for example, when we talk about India and China, we see, and it is said that Bangladesh so far has been able to handle the relationship with both the countries much better than many other countries in South Asia, including like say Nepal. One reason, as you also pointed out, the presence of different kinds of political parties and the kind of influence that they would want to seek from either country makes a difference. So in Bangladesh at present, what we see is often said, I mean, like, as again I said, I'm not a student in relations, that if there would be another government, maybe the relationship might not be the same. So my question therefore is, I mean, is it the smallness as such, and what aspect of smallness that makes these kinds of relationships in terms of geopolitics different, or is it something else that we might also have to look into? Thank you.
So I think you're absolutely right. Smallness is relative, and in fact, scholars like Tom Long have made the explicit argument that we should think about various bases of smallness and relative power, intrinsic power, etc. Like there's various ways in which we can think about the power of small states. So there's a whole literature on that. On Nepal, one of my former PhD students worked on looking at Nepal through the small states literature in international relations, and focusing on how that affects border politics and hydropolitics because these are concerns for the state. Now, smallness, I would argue smallness is not the only or the exhaustive means through which we can make sense of what we are talking about, but it is necessary. So in other words, it's a necessary but not sufficient marker of understanding this context. I don't think you could understand it without taking into account the smallness. But does that give us all the answers? Of course not. On the India-China Bangladesh thing, I mean, I think Bangladesh also has, I mean, the economic relationships that Bangladesh has with with major powers, its relationship, the texture of its relationship with the US and with China, I think are equally important in a way that makes it somewhat different from the countries in the Himalayas because of that, and the contest that has presented in terms of, on the one hand, a focus on trade, and on the other hand, something to do with, some concern with values. So it's not a, I mean, I think I would qualify that statement about Bangladesh has done better than Nepal with done better on what, in what arenas and for whom. I would, given the current kind of political context, and especially the relationship it has with these two very different sorts of entities, US and China at present. I think the point is that, however, that not that small states are good per se, but they have the potential, if we approach an understanding that centralizes the security perspectives of small states, I think we can get to a more not collegial, because that's with persons, a more stable, multilateral discussion focused understanding, rather than just like it's me or you, or like who shoots first kind of a thing that we were talking about just a moment ago. So and the reason for that is also partly very partly it has to do with the fact that the capacities, the focus. So specifically, if we look at in the context of small state diplomacy, there it's often more goal oriented, because when you have fewer resources, you have to do better in order to allocate them, and you can't take the sorts of risks, and you can't take the sorts of you don't have as much leeway, so you have to be more focused. And small states, once they have a goal, are often better at pursuing those goals in the international arena. Those goals may not always be the best ones, but I think on balance, they're less likely to be insecurity provoking goals in the in the wider context. They're more likely to be about safeguarding interests. That's not to say that domestic politics in small states is immune, to the usual sorts of things like corruption, etc. But it's and they do present a diversity of outcomes if we look at index rankings of small states. But So it's not that they are by default, but they have basically less to gain from conflict, or from prolonged conflict. And when focused, they tend to do well, as we see in the context, not politically, but in the context of economic context of Bangladesh, more in the last recent years. Of course, the particular histories of small states matter, and in that context, again, Nepal and Bhutan have often done very different things, and it's and that's something that, I mean, I could direct you, because that's a much bigger thing about the foreign policies of small states, where I've argued that when we look at the conventional basis for understanding the foreign policy of small states, there's also something like distances that we should think about. So there's the usual ways in which we think about it. I can direct you to the article. It's called Beyond India and China, Bhutan as a Small State in International Relations. That the idea of distances plays a role, because, for example, in understanding the relationships that small states build, in terms of how they internationalize, it's often near doesn't always mean close. So it's because there's a need to focus resources, there's a need to select sequencing properly. So often it is determined by affinities and shared values and things like that also, as much as so the idea of distances and including like attributional distances that small states often seek to bridge. They will actually pursue in very innovative ways. Like there can be a diplomacy of silences that often plays a role, or not being very kind of being flexible, being coordinated, but also being flexible to the scenario and the whole norm entrepreneurship. I mean, there's other scholars, Serena Thays and others, who've done work on norm entrepreneurship, including in the context of Bhutan, like promoting certain values because that's their strength. Not saying that this is the answer or their ideal, but saying that we should give some attention in terms of how we understand a region, some part of our attention. It should not exclusively be about great power priorities and rivalries. We should also give some attention to the conditions under which multilateralism works more, relationalities come into play, the role that affect plays in geopolitics, and the ways in which these kinds of questions can be looked at from by anchoring them in questions of security for whom, or is this rational, or who is this feasible for, who benefits from this, those kinds of things that shift the attention away from a default understanding of power means this and not doing this means humiliation. I mean, I would even go so far as to say that historically this has been a huge problem, that precisely because we have all learned, and again, this is something that's part of my published work as well, but precisely because we have all somehow learned and imbibed that colonial histories, that in terms of colonial histories, and for some reason there's a fixation on recent Western colonialism, when colonialism is a big long story, but colonial histories have to do with the failure of the colonized rather than than the actions of the colonizers. That this is, I mean, my God, understanding the present political projects in so many countries, especially South Asian countries, you have to like really pay attention to what I just said, because the idea is that, we were weak and we could not resist the colonizers and we failed. And now XYZ is going to come along and deliver us from all our historical injustices and get us our place in the sun. That whole thing is premised upon a faulty logic. The shame in colonization is absolutely not that of the colonized, but of the colonizers. It's, it isn't a moral failing to have been colonized. The problem is the colonial act, whoever does it, is the colonial exercise of power. But this kind of understanding of history also entrenches that basically what power means is that you go and do, as that gentleman was saying, that you go and do the same thing to others. So, you could have been colonized, but you end up thinking that the having of power, the having of status means you have to replicate those exact same processes and act in those sorts of ways and replicate that. And that's problematic. I think that if we understood these histories from the perspective of colonizing as being the shameful act rather than being colonized as having been a moral failure or humiliation or shame. What is humiliating, honestly, about being colonized? I just, honestly, if we actually for a moment stopped and looked at it, why is that? I mean, that's the shame is, there's a kind of maybe thinking about gender politics makes us think about it. Like, why should it be the shame of, why should colonial history be a shame for the colonized countries of the world? It should exactly be a shame for the colonizer countries. Because you do not, I mean, there are contests and there are different material capabilities and certain kinds of, the invader is the entity that needs to have stigma attached to it. It's the seeking of spheres of influence that needs to be stigmatized, not not what results from it in contexts where people are having to struggle against all odds. And so what we're seeing is those historical processes that were once the preserve of the West now being replicated elsewhere, because everyone thinks that that's what the having of power means, in that we just have to find ways of getting our own way and riding roughshod over everyone else and their concerns. And that just sets up this these pernicious cycles, both of how we behave internationally and what we allow internationally, but also of domestic politics in the way in which this whole history is sought to be converted into a politics of time and futurity, of the return of the future as a return to the past, whether that is a past of, in some countries, of imperial glory, or in other countries of pre-colonial native purity. Sorry, I've strayed a long while away from this, but I think that these sorts of questions, the big picture questions, often about values, and probably it doesn't harm our discipline to think more carefully about what we naturalize and how that impacts the questions that we are able to consider and the things that we take for granted.
Yeah. Good afternoon, I'm Avnish. I've just come to Singapore a few months ago, and I head the Confederation of Indian Industries office over here. But I'm not here in that capacity. I'm more here in my previous role. I used to head the international affairs for the Society of Indian Defense Manufacturers, a fairly new organization set up by the MOD and the MEA. So we work with South Asia, Africa, and my role was to engage with all these countries and promote Indian strategic interests. But the question is, in today's atmosphere, and looking at small states and having interacted with some of them closely, the small states, even if they want to have an option or a voice on their own, unfortunately, they don't, because of actions of other geopolitical players. But in this case, it's heavily China dominated, and that is why India is also then reacting, and then that creates a cascading effect. So how do you then give the voice to a smaller state when it is under the influence, almost all the time under the influence of a big player? Even in, let's say, in the next 15-20 years, there is a case of multilateralism, more cordial dialogue. But then one state decides to act differently, as China has done in the past 10 years, and then we are back to square one. So how do you address that?
Could you repeat the last bit, just the very last bit, the last sentence?
Yes. So let's say in the next 15-20 years, we have had multilateralism, cordial dialogue, and then one big player decides to do something different, like China has done in the past 10 years, and then it's a cascading effect all over again, and then the voice is cut down. So the inherent, how do you make a case for an inherent voice for the small state? Because they'll never have so.
There's the truism, never say never. There are, if we look at distance gives perspective. If we look at histories in the longer run, then I think that it does present us with accounts of power that are more varied, and with small states that have punched above their weight. So it is, it's not, I don't know whether something not, being difficult in the present makes it impossible for us to consider why moving towards that goal might make things better in the long run for everyone. So I think that if we're thinking about, we are right now hurtling towards a situation of exacerbated rivalries in different parts of the globe, of various regions, in some ways rather similar to the old Cold War, various regions becoming just, arenas for these rivalries playing out, and circulations between authoritarian states, but that's unsurprising, but also democracies and authoritarian states, of certain kinds of modalities of repression of populations and erosion of the standard democratic relationships between citizen and the state, in the standard relationship between citizen and state, and in other words, citizens as rights-bearing subjects. So So I'm saying we're heading globally to a very bad place, and it's not. We've been through various nightmares. It's not unique, but I think it should give us cause to think. And one very kind of immediate reason for this is thinking about things like climate change, and thinking about environmental policies, and thinking about how in one domain, if the whole zero-sum way of thinking about these things and thinking about a focus on rivalries in some arenas can then also translate into making cooperation either ineffective or impossible in other arenas where it actually might be in everyone's interests to cooperate, such as on the question of environment and other similar kinds of transborder challenges. So there are domains in which we want to cooperate more, and but does that become in effect very difficult? And I'm arguing that it does if we continue only thinking in these zero-sum terms. And I'm saying we should find ways that move us away from this kind of polarized, rivalrous way of thinking about what power is, what the having of it means, and what and questions of security. I'm a big fan of Jonathan Mercer's work. He's an IR scholar. And I think that this, in a sense, part of your question also directs us to this whole question of what status is and what status-seeking behaviors look like, and what and security for what and for whom. And typically, the idea of status is often seen in, again, these very problematic terms. But I would also again always remind us and caution that these are constructed understandings, that these are perceptions that have been shaped by vocabularies that we have inherited and often not questioned enough. If we think in lots of other disciplines, domains, and indeed in the history of the world, languages and vocabularies and critical thinking helps us change and think about relations and entities differently. So I think that that's one thing that's possible. Now in the you said so that was the thing. I would say that my worry is actually, so you're saying that that there's obviously a certain transformation in China post in the Xi era, post 2012. That's obviously there, and for everyone to see. I would even worry whether that sort of model does not present an appealing example to many other countries and to democracies. I would argue that there's often this appeal in democracies of that kind of strongman authoritarian leadership that lifts standard of living and makes people's lives better in a material sense, but not also always that, and fundamentally erodes the very basic democratic principles that democracies are meant to uphold. And I did say my bias at the start, right? I prefer democracies to authoritarian systems. That and I'm using these terms in a very, very kind of superficial sense. So I'm not even talking about substantive democracies. I'm talking about simply like rule of law type things, citizen basic rights like elections and rule of law and being able to get judicial remedy, like that level. So this is not a very strong argument. This is actually just like, let's have the basics, please. The kind of basics of liberal democracy. So my worry is actually the reverse. It's not simply that it's reacting, but of course that what we see in terms of China's behavior, increasingly through this kind of leadership is sought to be emulated elsewhere. And in that context, I actually worry for India and what that represents for the future, because I think there are values that are worth pursuing, and that they are not, there's a lot of the intangible stuff that makes the tangible seem tangible. And I don't know, I'm trying, this is, it's not, so I'm trying to kind of, this is where, we're having this discussion. There's a lot more I could say, but I think that my worries about the convergence actually in the India-China context. The convergence in terms of the appeal of a certain kind of system over another. Obviously I'm not saying that, countries should fight each other simply because they have different systems of government, but I think that there's something valuable about democratic systems. For small states, of course, that means, as I said, they're often, small states that are caught in between, typically would want, if they're in the middle of this kind of situations, they hedge. But then we should ask questions, actually orient the whole discourse to ask questions, not just that, oh, well, they hedge and, how do we get this or that thing from them? The question, like, when do they, how do they, more kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a heterarchy. I think we have to think more in terms of not hierarchies, but heterarchies. We have to think more in terms of sequencings and, and how these things play out from the perspective of small states. So what I'm presenting to you is like, this is the canvas that we might also be thinking about. And there are lots of specific questions that you could ask that, that could help move us along all the way. And small state scholars, as I said, are helping us get there. In terms of increasingly asking these questions, much in the same way as at one point, questions of equal rights or gender or any of that seemed impossible to take seriously in IR, but we do now. And I think that also this, this argument, I think I would argue that we can and we should ask these different questions. Yeah, because really you were saying, how can we do this? And this is really difficult and it is impossible. And I'm saying, maybe it's not impossible. Maybe it takes a lot of time, but then everything takes time and paradigms shift gradually. And I think it just requires us to think differently about security. I mean, honestly, COVID was such a good example. Literally almost every other small state did so much better at human security. And all of these countries that had these massive amounts of resources at their beck and call. So what I mean is that this is the kind of mutation evolutionary type argument as well. There's and now that we are on the cusp of the AI and the digital transformation, like literally a chip or one little thing in the chain that happens to be somewhere. We're all thinking Taiwan, but also let's try and diversify that. All of those things. So what we mean by security, what we mean by alliances, what we mean by power, we could all do better by rethinking the bases of some of these, because it isn't just about the usual sorts of things. And I'm very aware of the fact that some people would say, no, yes, it is always going to be about the usual sorts of things, and that's fine too. I'm not seeking to convert everyone. It's fine for us to disagree. Oh, but sorry, can I say one last thing to him? Because you mentioned your very interesting work with, did you say the International Affairs for Indian Defense Manufacturers? And that's, increasingly, I think it's okay, two things to that. One, cognitive dissonance. I sometimes wonder if in certain kinds of domains, how we reconcile with cognitive dissonance, and probably like, the defense manufacturing is probably one of them. I think the head of Thales, or I'm trying to think which one. There was this interview very recently of a person in the UK. I can't remember who he was. Head of a major defense manufacturing firm. And he was asked in this interview, it was this very detailed interview. And he was asked, well, do you think about how your actions are actually leading to greater insecurity? And he said, precisely the opposite. Actually, what I'm doing is leading to greater insecurity. So I think it's also a reminder that literally the stories that we tell make up the reality for us. And we could choose to tell better stories. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for your wonderful, enlightening talk. I hope we will be cooperate and collaborate more
Yes.
with you in future and with your university also.
Yes, absolutely. I did want to say that should anyone be passing through the UK, please do get in touch. We're always looking to host speakers, and we have a lot of people who work on very different things. So it doesn't have to be a small states thing. If you're whatever your areas of expertise, please feel free to get in touch. And
Thanks.
thank you.
On behalf of ISIS, we'd just like to thank Professor Natasha and Dr. Amit for such an engaging and delightful discussion. For everyone who joined us today, thank you. We do hope to see you at future ISIS events. And thank you and have a good day.
Thank you.